It's a quiet Tuesday morning just like any other. The sun rises, birds chirp, and the world seems to be moving on without a care. But in one unassuming house, behind closed doors, something unbelievable is about to unfold. Something that will change the lives of a family forever. What I discovered next will shock you. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe and leave a comment below telling me what time it is where you're watching from. Trust me, you won't want to miss a single second. This story is going to keep you on the edge of your seat until the very end. Roy Hayes, a widower in his late 60s, wakes up to an empty house. His wife, Ellen, has been gone for over a year now, and though the grief still lingers in his heart, he's learned to live with it. But today, something is different. He stands at the window, looking out over the empty street, a sense of determination settling over him. He's about to do something that will shock everyone he knows. His daughter Caitlin, her husband Jeremy, and even the neighbors. No one will see this coming. Today isn't just another day. It's the day Roy Hayes finally takes control. The house at 1247 Maple Street has been home to Roy and Ellen for over 25 years. It's where they raised Caitlin, where they celebrated birthdays, anniversaries, holidays. But for Roy, the house is no longer a place of comfort. It's a reminder of everything he's lost: his wife, his peace of mind, and now his family. Caitlin and Jeremy, once the people he thought he could rely on, have shown their true colors. Behind closed doors, they've been planning something that will devastate him. You see, Roy isn't just any old man. He's not the frail, helpless father that Caitlin and Jeremy think he is. For months, he's been plotting, watching, listening, and now everything he's been working towards is about to come to fruition. His life, his future, no longer belongs to anyone else but him. But here's the thing: the real shock isn't that Roy is finally standing up for himself. The real shock is what he's about to do with nearly $900,000 in the bank, money that Caitlin and Jeremy believed would be theirs for the taking. Imagine this: you walk into the home where you grew up, expecting to find the comfort of family, only to find that everything has changed. The house is empty. Your father is gone, the locks have been changed, and your inheritance, the one you thought was waiting for you, has disappeared. All that's left is a note written in his careful, deliberate hand, and when you read it, your world shatters. That's exactly what's about to happen to Caitlin and Jeremy. They think they have everything figured out. They think they can control Roy, push him into a nursing home, sell the house, and take what they believe is rightfully theirs. But what they don't know is that Roy has already made his move, and now they'll have to face the consequences of their cruelty. Caitlin, Jeremy, get ready. Roy Hayes is done being the burden you always thought he was. This isn't just a story about a father standing up to his children. It's a story about justice. It's about revenge, sure, but it's also about reclaiming what was stolen from him. Roy's not just fighting for his money, he's fighting for his dignity, his independence, and most importantly, he's fighting for a chance to make them see him for who he really is. So why would Roy do this? Why would he go to such extreme lengths? The answer lies in the betrayal he's endured. Caitlin and Jeremy thought they could manipulate him. They thought they could push him aside, use him for their own gain. They couldn't have been more wrong. And now, with everything in place, it's time for Roy to teach them a lesson they'll never forget. But here's the real question: will Caitlin and Jeremy ever truly understand the depth of their mistake? Or will they continue to believe that they were entitled to what wasn't theirs? What will happen when they find out that their father has outsmarted them at every turn? Stay tuned. You're about to witness a moment of pure, unapologetic justice. This is the moment Roy Hayes steps into his power, and Caitlin and Jeremy are about to realize that their father is not someone they should ever underestimate. But there's still more to come. Keep watching, because the shock doesn't end here. Roy Hayes sat in his worn armchair, the fabric a little threadbare after years of use, but it was still his favorite place in the house. He glanced at the photo on the mantel, a younger version of himself with Ellen by his side, their arms wrapped around each other as they smiled into the camera. It was one of the last happy memories he had before life turned upside down. Their daughter Caitlin had been just a little girl back then, her innocent face beaming with joy as she held up a drawing for her parents. Those were the days. Those were the moments he never thought would end, the days when their little family was everything to him. The house on Maple Street was more than just a building. It was a symbol of love, stability, and the life Roy had worked so hard to build. It was a testament to Ellen's devotion, her meticulous eye for design, and the way she had made their home warm, inviting. A sanctuary from the outside world. For 25 years, this house had been the center of his universe, and for 25 years it had been the heart of his family. But now Roy was alone. He was 67 years old, a man who had spent his entire life working with his hands, first as a carpenter, then as a contractor. His career had been a source of pride for him, each project a labor of love. Roy was a quiet, unassuming man who didn't need much to be happy. He found joy in simple things: a cup of coffee in the morning, the feel of fresh wood under his fingers, the smile of his daughter when she'd call him for advice, the occasional trip to the park with Ellen when they had time to themselves. Those moments, those small but powerful memories, had shaped Roy into the man he was today. But now none of that mattered. Ellen had passed away from cancer a little over a year ago. It had been swift, brutal, and in the end left Roy with a profound sense of emptiness. She was gone, and the world felt different without her in it. Caitlin, their only daughter, had been there in the beginning, supporting her father through the worst of the grief. But as time passed, something changed. Caitlin and her husband Jeremy began to visit less often, and their conversations started to feel more strained. Roy couldn't put his finger on it, but he sensed that something wasn't quite right. It wasn't until one fateful conversation that Roy realized just how much things had changed. He had overheard Caitlin and Jeremy talking one night, their voices carrying from the other room. They didn't know he was listening, but their words cut deep. "We can't keep doing this. We can't keep taking care of him forever," Caitlin had said, her voice low but filled with frustration. "We need to do something before he becomes too much of a burden." Jeremy's voice followed. "I know, the nursing home is the best option. It's not ideal, but at least it'll free up the house. We can sell it, make a good profit." Roy had stood frozen in place, the weight of their words pressing on him like a vice. The house, the home he had built with Ellen, was nothing more than a financial asset to Caitlin and Jeremy, a burden to be discarded. His heart had shattered in that moment, and it felt as though everything he had given to his family, everything he had worked for, had been erased. For months, Roy had been fighting an internal battle, torn between the love he still felt for his daughter and the deep sense of betrayal he had experienced. He had raised Caitlin to be strong, independent, and kind, but the woman she had become, the woman he had to watch from a distance, wasn't the daughter he had known. Somewhere along the way, her kindness had been replaced with a sense of entitlement, and Jeremy, the man she married, had only fueled that sense of entitlement, pushing for the nursing home, pushing for the sale of the house. Roy couldn't allow that to happen, so he began to plan. He started taking small steps, all the while pretending to be the same old Roy Hayes, the man who was content to stay out of the way and let others take charge. He started to put his affairs in order, gathering paperwork, getting his financials in line, and seeking out the one thing that would give him the independence he needed to make a fresh start: money. Lots of it. The decision to sell the house was a difficult one, but it was the only way Roy could regain control of his life. It was his last act of independence. And while he knew it would shock Caitlin and Jeremy, he also knew it was the only way to show them who he really was, a man who could no longer be taken for granted, a man who had fought his entire life for everything he had, and who was not about to let his daughter and son-in-law take it all from him. For weeks, Roy worked in the background, contacting real estate agents, looking into the sale of the house, all the while pretending to be the same old man his family had come to expect. He knew Caitlin and Jeremy wouldn't see it coming. They would think he was too old, too fragile to make any real decisions on his own. They would think they could push him around and get away with it. What they didn't know was that Roy was far from helpless. He was a man who had spent decades learning how to survive on his own, who had worked long hours and built his career from the ground up. He had never been a man to sit idly by. And now, with everything he held dear hanging in the balance, he was ready to fight. The sale of the house would provide him with nearly $900,000, enough to secure a new life, a life where he could live on his own terms. But this money wasn't just about buying a new home or paying for the future. It was about showing Caitlin and Jeremy that they had underestimated him. They thought they could control him, use him as a means to an end. But Roy Hayes was about to show them that he was not a man to be manipulated. As the days passed, Roy felt a sense of clarity and purpose that had eluded him for so long. Each morning, as he sat in his favorite armchair looking at the empty rooms around him, he realized something important. He didn't need to wait for his daughter's approval. He didn't need her permission to live his life the way he saw fit. He had spent too many years giving to others, sacrificing his own dreams, his own desires for the sake of his family. Now it was time to take back what was his. But still, even as he made his plans, part of him struggled with the idea of confronting Caitlin. She was his daughter, after all. He had loved her more than anything in this world, but love, he had learned, wasn't always enough. She had crossed a line, and now Roy had to teach her a lesson she would never forget. He had been through so much in his life, loss, heartbreak, betrayal, but nothing had prepared him for this. Caitlin wasn't the little girl he had raised anymore. She was an adult, a woman who had her own ideas about what she deserved. And now Roy was about to show her what it meant to take responsibility for one's actions. It wasn't easy. It wasn't something Roy wanted to do, but it was something he had to do for his own peace of mind, for his own future. And as the days drew closer to the sale of the house, he could feel the weight of what he was about to do pressing on him. He wasn't just selling a house. He was selling his past, his memories, and the life he had shared with Ellen. But in doing so, he was also freeing himself from a future that had been forced upon him, a future where he was no longer in control. As Roy sat in his armchair, the sun setting outside the window, he thought back on the years he had spent with Ellen. They had been good years, filled with love, laughter, and hard work. But now Ellen was gone, and Roy had to face the reality of his life without her. He couldn't keep living in the past. He had to move forward. He had to find a way to live the rest of his life on his own terms. The journey ahead would be difficult, but Roy was ready to show his daughter and son-in-law that he was more than just an old man. He was a man who had lived, who had loved, and who would not be controlled by anyone. Roy Hayes had always believed that his life was a carefully constructed building, one that he had spent years designing, brick by brick. He had worked hard to provide for his family, to ensure that Caitlin would grow up with the stability and comfort that he had never known as a child. His love for Ellen had been the foundation upon which everything had been built. The house, the career, the memories, all of it had been a testament to their shared vision of a future together. But the cracks, which had slowly started to appear over the years, were now impossible to ignore. The roof of his life was beginning to crumble, and what once felt like a safe haven was now becoming a fragile facade. It all came crashing down one night in the spring as Roy was sitting in the quiet solitude of his home. Ellen's photograph sat on the mantel, the soft glow of the lamp casting a warm light on her smile. For a moment, Roy felt the familiar pang of grief. The longing for a time when things were simpler, when he was not alone. His life with Ellen had been filled with warmth, humor, and mutual respect. They had built a life together, and it had always been enough. But that life was slipping away, and with it, his sense of security. The phone call came late in the evening, just after dinner. Roy had already washed the dishes, dried his hands on the towel, and was about to settle in for a quiet night of reading when the phone rang. He wasn't expecting any calls, and his first thought was that it must be Caitlin calling to check in on him. She had done that less often lately, but he still hoped for a connection, a chance to talk to her, to hear her voice. Perhaps, just perhaps, she still cared. But when he picked up the receiver, it wasn't Caitlin's voice he heard. It was Jeremy's. "Mr. Hayes," Jeremy said, his voice cold and formal. "Caitlin and I need to talk to you. It's about the house." The words hung in the air like a lead balloon, and for a moment Roy couldn't speak. He had known this day would come. He had known that the moment he made the decision to sell the house, it would cause a rift in his family. But hearing it from Jeremy so bluntly made the reality of the situation all the more painful. "The house," Roy finally managed to ask, his voice barely a whisper. Jeremy's tone shifted slightly, but only just enough for Roy to catch the subtle shift, a hint of impatience, maybe even irritation. "Yes, we need to figure out what's going to happen. We've been talking about it, and we think it's time to make some decisions." Roy's heart raced. He felt a wave of anger rising in his chest, but he kept his voice steady. "What decisions, Jeremy?" There was a pause on the other end of the line before Jeremy spoke again. "We're going to have to put you in a nursing home, Roy. We can't keep taking care of you like this. It's getting too much." The words hit Roy like a punch to the gut. He gripped the phone tightly in his hand. Knuckles white, his mind raced, but his thoughts couldn't seem to catch up to the reality of what had just been said. A nursing home. Caitlin and Jeremy were going to send him to a place he didn't want to be, a place where he would be treated like a burden, like he had no value, like he was disposable. It wasn't the first time they had discussed the idea of a nursing home. Caitlin had mentioned it before as if it were the natural next step for someone of Roy's age. Someone who was now a widower and living alone. But hearing it from Jeremy, hearing it so coldly, with no compassion or understanding, struck Roy to his core. It was as if he had been reduced to a mere object, a problem to be solved, a task to be checked off. "I'm not going to a nursing home," Roy said, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. "I don't need you to make decisions for me." Jeremy's voice was dismissive. "You don't have a choice. It's for your own good, Roy. We can't keep doing this forever." The words stung more than Roy cared to admit. They weren't said with kindness, with concern. They were said with a sense of finality, as if Roy's life had already been mapped out for him, as if his desires, his wishes, his memories didn't matter at all. "You don't get to decide that for me," Roy said, his voice shaking with emotion now. "I've lived my life. I've worked hard for everything I have, and I'll decide what happens to me. You don't get to take that away from me." There was a long silence on the other end of the line before Jeremy spoke again, his tone more clipped now. "I'm not asking for your permission, Roy. It's already been decided. We'll handle everything. You'll be moved next week. We'll come by tomorrow to talk details." The line went dead. Roy stood there, staring at the phone in his hand, his body rigid with anger. How had it come to this? How had Caitlin and Jeremy, his own flesh and blood, decided that he was no longer worthy of their love, their respect? How had they come to see him as nothing more than a burden? The feeling of betrayal hit him like a wave, crashing over him, drowning him in confusion and hurt. He couldn't understand it. He couldn't accept it. He had given them everything he had, his time, his energy, his love. And now, after all these years, after everything he had sacrificed, they were treating him as if he were nothing more than an inconvenience. His hands shook as he set the phone down on the kitchen counter. But his mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, none of them making any sense. It was as if everything he had worked for, everything he had built, had been reduced to ashes in an instant. Roy walked slowly into the living room, his legs unsteady, his breath shallow. The house around him, the house that had once been filled with laughter, love, and warmth, now felt cold, foreign. The walls seemed to close in on him, pressing in from all sides. The photo of Ellen on the mantel seemed to mock him, reminding him of everything he had lost. He sat down heavily in his armchair, staring out the window at the quiet street outside. His heart ached with grief, but now there was something else, a deep, burning fury. The sense of betrayal gnawed at him, a constant, insidious ache. He felt as though he had been pushed into a corner with no way out, no way to reclaim what had been taken from him. The tears came then, hot and unexpected, streaming down his face. He wiped them away angrily, furious at himself for feeling so weak, so helpless. But in that moment, he understood. This wasn't just about a nursing home. This was about everything, the life he had built, the family he had loved, the years of hard work that had all been taken for granted. And something inside him snapped. Roy Hayes wasn't going to let them take his life away. He wasn't going to let them steal his dignity. They had underestimated him. Thought him weak, thought him incapable of standing up for himself. But Roy Hayes wasn't done yet. He was about to fight for everything he had left, everything that mattered. And the first step in that fight was to make them understand what it meant to betray him. The next day, Roy began making plans, quietly and methodically. He would no longer be the man they thought they knew. He would show them that even in the twilight of his life, he still had power. The sale of the house was just the beginning. They had set the wheels in motion. Now it was time for him to take control of his own destiny once more. And Roy Hayes would make sure that Caitlin and Jeremy learned the lesson of a lifetime. Never underestimate a man who has nothing left to lose. Roy Hayes had always prided himself on his ability to control the situations in his life. Even when things had seemed uncertain or difficult, he had maintained a sense of order, a belief that he could solve any problem if he applied enough effort. For years, he had been the architect of his own life, shaping his world with a steady hand. But in the days following the phone call from Caitlin and Jeremy, everything seemed to slip beyond his reach. It was a cold, overcast morning when Roy's carefully constructed world began to fall apart. He had spent the past few days preparing, gathering his strength, trying to hold onto the fragile semblance of control he still had over his life. He thought he had a plan, that he could still manage to hold onto his dignity, but as the days wore on, the weight of his decisions started to crush him. The first crack came when he received the call from the nursing home. They were ready for him. The paperwork had been signed, the arrangements made, and everything was set in motion. He had thought he could stall it, fight it, but there was no escaping it. The house was sold, the money was already moved to an account they would never know about, and the final step in his children's plan was to get him out of the picture. They had done it. They had succeeded in pushing him to the edge, where he no longer had any power. Caitlin and Jeremy had already started to move their things out of the house, as if preparing for their own new life. The irony of it all gnawed at him, his own daughter and son-in-law treating the house he had built with Ellen like it was theirs to take. It was as if his decades of effort and love meant nothing to them. The house that had once been a symbol of their family was now nothing more than an empty shell, a place for them to store their possessions, a place they could manipulate. A place that no longer belonged to him. Roy hadn't wanted to acknowledge it, but he couldn't deny the truth anymore. He was alone. His children had made their decision. They no longer saw him as a father or a man deserving of respect. They saw him as a liability, something to be discarded. His world was slipping through his fingers like sand. But it wasn't just the house or the betrayal from his children that was weighing on him. It was everything. The grief of losing Ellen still lingered, a constant ache in his chest. He missed her in ways that words couldn't express, and no matter how much he tried to fill the void she left behind, it was always there, hovering over him, reminding him that his life would never be the same. He had tried to move on, to rebuild, but it was clear now that he was fighting a losing battle. The pain of her absence had chipped away at him, eroding his resolve until there was nothing left but the remnants of his former self. On the day when everything came to a head, Roy stood in the empty house, looking around at the bare walls and vacant rooms. He had taken all his personal belongings, all the things that had mattered to him, and moved them out, but there was nothing left to hold on to. The furniture that had once been the backdrop to his life with Ellen was gone. The house felt hollow, empty of everything but memories. The silence was deafening. He had promised himself that he would never let it come to this. He had sworn he would leave on his own terms, that he would be the one to make the decisions, but now he was standing there, completely powerless. His hands shook as he locked the door for the last time, the weight of the key in his hand feeling heavier than it ever had before. The house was no longer his. His life, as he had known it, was no longer his. Everything he had worked for, everything he had sacrificed, had been stripped away. Roy felt a deep, unbearable sadness sweeping over him. It was as though the ground beneath him had given way and he was falling into an abyss. There was no escape from the suffocating weight of the grief and betrayal that consumed him. His children had betrayed him in the worst possible way, and now, as he stood in the remains of his life, he realized that there was no way to turn back. The phone buzzed in his pocket, jolting him out of his thoughts. He pulled it out, his fingers numb. It was Caitlin. "Dad," her voice came through the phone, distant and mechanical. "We're coming over to finalize everything. We need to talk. I'll be there in an hour." Roy stared at the screen, his mind racing. He didn't want to see her. He didn't want to hear her voice. The betrayal stung so deeply that every word she spoke felt like a knife in his chest, but he had no choice. She was coming, and he had to face her, face them, her and Jeremy, the people he had once loved so dearly. The people who had turned their backs on him without a second thought. He put the phone down and stood there in the empty room, feeling the weight of the silence pressed down on him. The house was gone, and now his family was slipping away too. The thought of Caitlin, the daughter he had raised, standing in front of him and telling him he was a burden was more than he could bear. It wasn't long before the sound of footsteps outside the door broke the silence. Caitlin and Jeremy had arrived. Roy stood frozen, his legs too weak to carry him. He knew what was coming. He could feel it in his bones. They were going to finish what they had started. They were going to take the last thing he had left, his dignity. The door opened and Caitlin stepped inside, followed by Jeremy. She looked at him with the same detachment she had shown him on the phone. There was no warmth in her eyes, no trace of the love that had once bound them together. It was as if she was looking at a stranger. "Dad, we need to talk," Caitlin said, her voice cold. "It's time for you to move on. We've made arrangements. You're going to the nursing home. It's for your own good. We've already packed your things, and the movers will be here tomorrow." Roy felt as though the ground had been ripped out from under him. He couldn't speak. He couldn't move. The words felt like they were being choked back, trapped in his throat. He had nothing left to say. His daughter was standing in front of him, telling him that his life was over, that he was no longer needed, no longer wanted. His chest tightened, and for a moment everything went dark. He felt as if he were drowning in the weight of his own emotions, betrayal, grief, anger, despair. It all crashed over him in a wave, leaving him gasping for air. He wanted to scream, to fight, to throw everything back in their faces, but he was too tired, too broken. The fight had been drained from him. Caitlin's voice continued, but it felt distant now, as if it were coming from underwater. "Dad, we've already taken care of everything. You don't need to worry about a thing. Just pack up your stuff and we'll take you to the nursing home tomorrow." Jeremy stood behind Caitlin, his expression one of smug satisfaction, as if he had won a victory, as if this was all part of some game he had been playing. Roy's vision blurred with tears. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. His throat was tight and his body felt like it was made of stone. "Caitlin, please." He finally managed, his voice barely a whisper. "Please don't do this," but Caitlin didn't respond. She turned away as if the conversation was already over. Jeremy moved to follow her, but Roy could see the smugness in his eyes, the indifference to the pain he had caused. And then as they left the room, the final blow came. Caitlin turned back to look at him once more, her face hard, emotionless. "Goodbye, Dad," she said, as if she were speaking to a stranger, and then she was gone. The door clicked shut behind them, leaving Roy alone in the darkness of his own home. He sank to his knees, his hands gripping the floor, his breath coming in ragged sobs. Everything was gone. The house, the love, the respect, everything he had worked for, everything he had fought for, had slipped away in the blink of an eye. He had nothing left, no family, no home, no future. Roy Hayes was broken. The world that he had built had collapsed, and he had no idea how to put it back together. He was lost, utterly lost. Then, for the first time in his life, he felt the crushing weight of despair. Roy Hayes had never been a man to wallow in self-pity. The years he had spent with Ellen were the best of his life, filled with love, family, and memories. But now, in the wake of the ultimate betrayal from Caitlin and Jeremy, something deep inside him shifted. He had spent the past few days in the depths of despair, convinced that his life was over, that he had lost everything. But now, in the quiet solitude of his small apartment, something stirred within him, a flicker of a thought. A quiet voice telling him that he could still fight, that he could still reclaim control. The weight of the grief, the anger, and the sorrow had consumed him for so long, but in that moment, Roy realized that his emotional breakdown had stripped away the illusions he had built around himself. He had been living in a kind of self-imposed prison, afraid to confront the truth of his situation. But now, in the aftermath of his own emotional collapse, he had been forced to face reality head-on. The truth was undeniable. His children had betrayed him. But the deeper truth, the one he hadn't allowed himself to see, was that he had allowed them to. For years, he had been playing the role of the dutiful father, always putting his family's needs above his own. He had sacrificed his own happiness, his own desires, all for the sake of their comfort and security. He had never questioned their motives. Never stopped to think about whether they truly appreciated him, or whether they saw him as nothing more than a means to an end. The realization stung, but it was also liberating. Roy finally understood that his life wasn't just about being a provider or a caretaker. It was about him. He had lost sight of who he was, of the man he had been before he became a father, before he became a husband. He had allowed himself to be defined by his relationships, by the roles he played, and now he was left with nothing but the remnants of those identities. But as the days passed, the fog of despair began to lift. Roy started to see things differently. He realized that this was not the end, it was the beginning of something new. The house was gone, but that didn't mean his life was over. His children had chosen their path, but that didn't mean he had to follow. There was still time. He still had his mind, his strength, and his ability to choose. Sitting in his small apartment, surrounded by the few possessions he had managed to save, Roy began to find clarity. He thought about Ellen, how she had always encouraged him to pursue his passions, to live for himself, to never lose sight of who he was. It was time to honor her memory, not by clinging to the past, but by stepping into the future with courage and conviction. The key to his freedom lay not in escaping his children, but in embracing the truth of his own existence. It was time to stop running away from the pain, the betrayal, and the grief. He had to face it all head-on. Only then could he heal and rebuild his life. Roy had spent too long denying himself the chance to truly live. He had been so consumed by his desire to keep everyone happy, to maintain the facade of a perfect family, that he had lost himself along the way. But now, in this moment of painful awakening, he understood that he could never reclaim his power by holding onto the past. He had to let go. He stood up from the chair, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on him. It was time to take action. He had made mistakes, yes, but he had also been a good man. He had loved deeply, sacrificed willingly, and worked hard to provide for his family. That was the man he needed to remember, the man who had the strength to overcome anything, no matter how insurmountable the odds seemed. Roy had always prided himself on his ability to adapt, to find solutions to even the most difficult problems. This was no different. He wasn't going to let his children's betrayal define him. He wasn't going to let their cruel actions steal his future. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of purpose stirring within him. He walked over to the small desk in the corner of his apartment and pulled out a notebook. It was time to start fresh, to create a new vision for his life. He began writing down his thoughts, letting the ideas flow freely onto the paper. He thought about what he wanted, what he needed to do to move forward. He wrote down goals, dreams, and aspirations, things he had long abandoned in the wake of his responsibilities as a father and husband. The first step, he decided, was to take control of his finances. He had already taken the necessary steps to secure his savings, but there was more to be done. He needed to ensure that he wasn't just surviving, he needed to be thriving. He began researching new investment opportunities, ways to grow his wealth, and how he could use his money to create the life he wanted. The betrayal by his children had shown him how fragile everything was, but it had also given him a renewed sense of urgency. He was no longer willing to sit back and wait for life to happen to him. The second step was to reclaim his personal identity. Roy had spent years putting everyone else's needs first, but now it was his turn. He made a promise to himself that he would start living for himself, not for his children, not for anyone else. He would pursue the things that brought him joy, the things that made him feel alive. He began planning trips he had always wanted to take, exploring hobbies he had abandoned years ago, and finding ways to rediscover the passions that had once fueled him. But perhaps the most important step of all was the decision to forgive. Roy had carried the weight of his children's betrayal for too long, and he knew that if he wanted to truly move forward, he had to let go of the anger and resentment that had been poisoning his heart. He would never forget what they had done, but he could choose to forgive them, not for their sake, but for his own. Forgiveness didn't mean excusing their actions. It didn't mean allowing them back into his life or pretending that everything was okay. It simply meant releasing the hold that their betrayal had on him. It meant freeing himself from the emotional chains that had kept him locked in a prison of bitterness and regret. He had carried their weight long enough. It was time to put it down and step into the future with a clean slate. The next few weeks were a blur of change and adjustment. Roy worked tirelessly to rebuild his financial security, investing in opportunities that aligned with his newfound goals. He took trips to places he had always wanted to visit, relishing the freedom that came with living on his own terms. He reconnected with old friends, rekindled old passions, and found himself rediscovering the joy of life. And as he did, something remarkable began to happen. Roy began to heal. The emotional scars of his betrayal, while still painful, no longer controlled him. He had faced the darkness and emerged stronger on the other side. He had learned that while he couldn't control the actions of others, he could always control how he responded. He had the power to choose his path, and he had chosen to move forward. The final piece of the puzzle came when Roy decided to write a letter to Caitlin and Jeremy. It wasn't a letter of anger or recrimination, but a letter of truth. He wrote about his pain, about the betrayal he had felt, but he also wrote about his journey, about the lessons he had learned and the man he had become. In the end, he knew that his children might never understand, but that didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that Roy Hayes had found himself again. He had rediscovered his strength, his purpose, and his capacity for love. He had learned that even in the face of betrayal, there was always the possibility of redemption, both for himself and for his relationship with his children. Roy Hayes had faced the darkest depths of despair and emerged victorious. He was no longer a victim of his circumstances. He was a man in control of his own destiny, and that, more than anything, gave him the freedom to live the life he had always deserved. For weeks, Roy Hayes had felt like a man adrift in an ocean of emotions. He had been betrayed by his own children, left to pick up the pieces of a life he had devoted everything to. But in the silence of his new, small apartment, something had changed. The bitterness, the despair, and the anger had all been channeled into something more powerful, something unshakable. Roy was no longer a man resigned to his fate. He was a man ready to take control. The day had finally come, the moment he had been waiting for. Caitlin and Jeremy would return from their trip to Phoenix to find that their carefully laid plans had fallen apart. Roy had executed every detail of his plan with precision, and now it was time for them to learn the lesson he had been preparing for them all along. They would no longer hold the power over his life. Roy stood in his small apartment, his mind racing as he stared out of the window at the Denver skyline. He could feel the weight of his decision pressing on him, but it no longer felt like a burden. He had taken back control, he had reclaimed his power, and now it was time to make sure his children understood just how far they had pushed him. The house was sold, and with it, any hope of Caitlin and Jeremy using him as a pawn in their financial games. He had no intention of forgiving them, not yet. Not after everything they had done, but he knew that revenge, while sweet, would not fill the emptiness in his heart. What they needed, what they truly deserved, was something far greater, a lesson in consequences. It had taken Roy weeks to meticulously set everything up. The sale of the house, the withdrawal of the funds, the carefully crafted letter to Caitlin and Jeremy, but it wasn't just about money. It was about teaching them that they couldn't just manipulate and betray their father without facing the consequences. The camera was ready. The locks on the house had been changed, and the note was taped to the front door, waiting for them to find it. Roy knew that when they arrived, they would be stunned. The house, their inheritance, the life they had planned to take from him, everything would be gone. They would have no choice but to confront the reality of their actions. And that's when the real payback would begin. Caitlin and Jeremy had no idea what awaited them. When they pulled into the driveway of Roy's former home, they expected to find it just as they had left it, a place to store their things, a property to sell. They had never considered that Roy would have outsmarted them, that he would have found a way to turn the tables. As Caitlin tried the key in the front door, her frustration grew. "That's weird," she muttered, jiggling the key, trying it again. It didn't fit. "What's going on?" she asked, turning to Jeremy, who was already checking the back door. Jeremy's concern deepened as he tried the garage door opener, only to find that it wasn't working either. "Something's not right," he muttered, panic starting to creep into his voice. They had no idea what they were about to walk into. Inside the house, their expectations were shattered when they found the white envelope taped to the door. Caitlin ripped it open, her hands trembling. The letter inside was written in Roy's careful script, the same script that had once held so many comforting words. But this time the words were different. The letter laid out the truth of their betrayal, the pain Roy had suffered, and the hard decision he had made to take control of his own life. Caitlin's face went pale as she read through the letter, the horror of her father's actions sinking in. "He sold the house," she whispered, her voice shaky. "He sold it, all of it, the money. It's gone." Jeremy took the letter from her, his mind racing. But how? How could he do this without telling us? The truth hit them like a hammer. They had taken it all for granted, assuming that their father would be a passive player in their schemes, that they could manipulate him for their own gain. But Roy had outwitted them at every turn. He had shown them that he was still in control of his own life, and that their manipulation had only pushed him to take a stand. The moment of realization was both exhilarating and bitter. Lesson Roy had been teaching them was now clear. You can't take advantage of someone who still has the power to fight back. Caitlin's tears were a mix of frustration, anger, and disbelief. This isn't happening," she cried. He can't just take everything from us." Jeremy, for the first time, seemed to lose his usual composure. He slammed his fist into the door frame, cursing under his breath. "This was supposed to be our future, our escape from everything. And now it's all gone." Roy's plan had worked. It wasn't about money. It was about showing them the consequences of their actions, the cost of treating a person like a means to an end. Money they thought they would inherit was gone, and with it any sense of entitlement they had once held. But Roy's justice wasn't finished yet. As Caitlin and Jeremy continued to stand there, reeling from the impact of the letter and the loss of the house, the next step of Roy's payback was about to unfold. In Roy's apartment, as he watched everything unfold through the camera feed, he could feel his heart racing. The payback had begun. He had no need for further confrontation. The house. The money, the letter, it was all part of the lesson he had planned so carefully. But there was one last piece of the puzzle. Caitlin and Jeremy had underestimated the depths of his resolve. They had thought him weak, they had thought him manageable, but now they would understand what happens when you push someone too far. Roy took a deep breath as he watched his daughter's face contort with confusion and disbelief. It was a bittersweet satisfaction. He didn't want to hurt them. But they needed to learn. He had given them everything, sacrificed his own dreams for theirs, and in return they had betrayed him in the most cruel and calculated way. They weren't the only ones who had learned something important. Roy had learned too. He had learned the power of choice, the importance of reclaiming his own life, and the necessity of protecting himself. For too long he had put everyone else's needs before his own, but not anymore. Now. He had taken back his life, and in doing so, he had made sure his children would never forget what they had done. The next morning, Caitlin and Jeremy were forced to confront the reality of their situation. With no inheritance, no house, and no way to manipulate their father's resources, they were left with the consequences of their actions. The world they had envisioned, where they could live off Roy's hard work and sacrifice, had crumbled. For Roy, this was the final act of justice. They had thought him old, weak, and easy to control. But now they saw the man he truly was, a father who had loved them but who would no longer be their pawn. He had given them everything, and now he would take it all back. The moment of payback was complete. Caitlin and Jeremy would never forget this lesson. It was the one lesson they hadn't counted on, the lesson of consequences. Roy had not only taken back his life, he had shown them that no one, no matter how much they thought they could manipulate, could ever take away his dignity or his strength. For the first time in months, Roy Hayes felt a sense of peace. He had confronted the darkness, fought back, and claimed the justice he deserved. He had found his own way, not through revenge, but through strength, independence, and the courage to stand up for himself. Roy Hayes had taken control. And the payback was not just a victory for him. It was a victory for everyone who had ever felt powerless, forgotten, or betrayed. The sun had set over Denver, casting a soft, golden light over the city as Roy sat alone in his small apartment. The day had been long, filled with unexpected twists and emotions. Yet as he sat quietly in his chair, looking out at the world he had once known, a sense of stillness washed over him. It was a calm that he hadn't felt in years. The battle was over. The war had been won, not with vengeance, but with quiet strength, patience, and an unwavering commitment to reclaiming his life. The tension in his chest had finally loosened, replaced by a deep, profound calm. He had done what he had set out to do. He had freed himself from the grip of manipulation, of false expectations, and most importantly, from the resentment he had carried for so long. His plan had been executed flawlessly, but it was no longer about the revenge. It was about the freedom he had gained. The life he could now begin to rebuild. Roy reached over and picked up the glass of wine that had sat untouched since he poured it hours ago. It was the 2018 Bordeaux, the bottle Ellen had always wanted to open on a special occasion. That special occasion had never come, but tonight it felt fitting. He lifted the glass, staring into the deep red liquid, lost in thought. Ellen's memory lingered in the quiet of the apartment. She had been his partner, his confidant. The love of his life. Losing her had shattered him, and for so long he had been left wandering, aimless, struggling with a grief that threatened to drown him. But now, as he sat in the silence, Roy finally understood something. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of possibilities. It was full of the future he had been afraid to pursue, the future he had allowed to slip away because of his own fear, because of his own sense of obligation. The truth was, he had been waiting for permission to live his life again. But no one was going to give him that permission. It was something he had to take for himself, and he had done it. His eyes drifted to the small photo of Ellen on the nightstand. He could almost hear her voice, gentle and loving as she always had been. "You're too generous for your own good, Roy," she used to say. She had been right. He had given so much of himself to everyone else, to his family, to his daughter, Caitlin, and to the life they had built together. But in doing so, he had lost sight of himself. Ellen had always understood that it was okay to put yourself first sometimes. And now, in this quiet moment, Roy realized that he had finally done just that. For so many years, he had lived under the shadow of his family's expectations. His children had taken for granted his love, his resources, and his trust. They had treated him like a means to an end. But Roy had shown them that he was more than that. He was a man of value, of dignity, and of strength. He had walked away from the life he had built, from the house where memories were made, to find something that was truly his, and though it had been hard, he had learned that there was nothing more liberating than reclaiming your own power. Roy took a deep breath and leaned back in his chair, the weight of his actions settling over him. He wasn't sure what the future held. The path ahead was unclear, and the world seemed vast, full of unknowns. But he no longer feared the unknown. He had embraced it, and that was enough. He had his health, his clarity, and his peace of mind. That was all he truly needed. The phone buzzed on the small table beside him. He glanced at it, half expecting another message from Caitlin, a frantic attempt to reach him. But he didn't pick it up. Instead, he let it buzz once more, then fall silent. The silence in the room felt different now. It wasn't the emptiness of loss, but the peaceful quiet that comes after a storm has passed. Roy knew that the world outside would keep turning. His children would have to pick up the pieces of their own lives, just as he had. And maybe, just maybe, they would learn something from all this. Maybe they would understand that love, when treated with disrespect, can wither, but respect once earned can never be taken away. As the night deepened, Roy's thoughts drifted to the future. Maybe there would be new adventures, places to explore, new people to meet, a life waiting to be lived. But for now, he was content in this moment of quiet reflection. The battle had been fought, and the lesson had been learned. Roy Hayes had done what he needed to do, and now, for the first time in years, he could finally sit in the silence, knowing that he had taken control of his own destiny. The wine was still in his hand, and he raised it toward Ellen's photo one last time, a simple gesture of love, of remembrance, and of finality. "To you, my love," he whispered softly, his voice steady. Justice served, and as the last light of the setting sun faded over the city, Roy took a final sip of the wine. It wasn't just a drink, it was the taste of freedom, the taste of peace, and the taste of a man who had finally found his way home. In the quiet of the night, Roy Hayes sat alone in his apartment, the world outside still turning, still moving forward. And as the camera zoomed out, capturing him in this rare moment of peace, the question lingered. What happens when a man takes control of his own fate? What happens when someone who's been wronged finds the strength to fight back? The answer, as Roy Hayes knew, was simple. They reclaim their life, they reclaim their peace, and in doing so, they find something worth living for. The final shot lingered on the peaceful expression on Roy's face, the sense of closure that had eluded him for so long now finally within his grasp. The story had ended, but Roy's new life was just beginning. And with that, the screen faded to black, leaving the audience to reflect on the journey they had just witnessed, the journey of a man who had reclaimed his strength, his dignity, and his freedom. Thank you for watching until the very end. If this story shocked you, made you feel something, or left you wanting justice served, don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment below. Share this story with your friends. Some truths only happen once, and we just witnessed a revenge plan unfold. Stay tuned for the next story. You won't want to miss it.